Let's talk about leavening. I've gotten a lot of confused questions. I thought you're not supposed to eat anything leavened on Pesach, but some of your recipes have baking soda, baking powder. What about yeast? I thought you can't have yeast. But if you think about it, we drink wine. Wine is made with yeast. People are confused. Also, I made sauerkraut. That's fermented. You can't have anything fermented. Let's talk about the word leaven. Now, first of all, I'm going to start out with saying, as Torah Jews, we do not practice via a literal translation of the Bible. The Bible is not ours, it's the Torah, and we don't translate things literally. That's not how Judaism works. Judaism is always practiced and understood based on the oral law, which was given alongside the written law, and you can't understand one without the other. You need to know the written law to understand the oral law, and vice versa, and the oral law is ginormous. There's a huge amount of it, a huge amount of discussion is involved in it, and it's ongoing today, but there are thousands of years of Jewish thought and arguments back and forth that have now been put down into writing, but originally were given as an oral tradition. And that's how Judaism is understood. So just by reading things literally, here's one example. It says, Lo sivaru eish b'chol moshe v'seichem. I think I got that quote right. For Shabbos, you're not supposed to have a fire burning in your house if you read it literally. But you can't understand that literally because we do have lights on in our house. And you can have hot food. You just can't light a new fire on Shabbos. But you can't understand that without the oral law. That said, this misunderstanding of what leaven we're not supposed to be having on Pesach has nothing to do with a not knowing of the oral law or a misunderstanding of the deeper meanings. It has to do with a straight mistranslation of the word sa'ar, which people translate as leaven. You could probably translate it better as levain. Any of you sourdough bakers know what I'm referring to now? Yes, sa'ar is sourdough starter. You should not have sourdough starter in your homes over Pesach. You should not eat anything made with sourdough starter, leaven, levain. That is what is prohibited. Not yeast, not baking powder, not baking soda. Things that are leavened via sourdough starter. That is what chametz is. Sourdough starter is the actual translation. And somebody once told me that in her son's school, they actually did translate sa'ar properly as sourdough starter. Now you understand why we can have wine that's made with yeast, fermented sauerkraut, and fermented pickles. Fermentation is not the problem. We can use kosher Pesach baking soda and baking powder. Things rising or being leavened is not the problem. The problem is sourdough starter, or fermented grains, made from one of the 5 grains that can become chametz. That's it. So we make matzah in less than 18 minutes, and that number is important because it's a number that the rabbis in ancient time came up with after much discussion. How much time does it take for that mixture of flour and water, grain and water, to start to ferment? And they decided that in less than 18 minutes, it for sure hasn't started fermenting yet. Now you have to remember that this ancient halachic discussion was taking place in the land of Israel in a hot, humid climate. So they felt that in more than 18 minutes, there's a possibility it may have started to become technically some sort of sourdough starter. You know, to us who live in cold climates, it take weeks to make our starter. We're like, that 18 minutes was the number decided on. By the way, you live in a hot and humid climate, you mix flour and water together, you'll come back a few hours, you will see and smell that it has started to ferment. When did it start? Apparently, after 18 minutes, it has started enough to be considered something that we don't eat on Pesach. So what is prohibited is sourdough starter, things made with sourdough starter, things that are starting to become sourdough starter, levain, not leaven. Things like baking soda and baking powder, and I have some kosher Pesach baking soda here, not prohibited. Now, there are some Jews, when it comes to Pesach, their customs are interesting. Different families, individual families can have different customs, and there are some families who have a custom not to use baking powder or baking soda on Pesach. There are people who don't use garlic on Pesach. There are people who don't even use sugar on Pesach. It's a funny thing when it comes to family customs on Pesach. Not going to go into individual family customs on Pesach because those can be wild. I mean, there are people who don't eat chicken because one time in a town where that family came from, they slaughtered a chicken on Pesach and found a single kernel of wheat inside. So they decided not to eat chicken anymore on Pesach. It's a lot of fun, but these are family customs. These are not the halacha or the law. The halacha does not prevent you from eating yeast, baking soda, baking powder, or things that are fermented on Pesach. The only issue is Sa'ar, levain, sourdough starter, and now you know.